Thank you, Sophia, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. It is wonderful to see you all. We're so delighted to have you here. This is really a vision that we have at ADF International, to be able to host these sorts of evenings and conversations and bring great people together for good discussion and thought-provoking topics. So I hope that this evening will meet that threshold. I want to begin this evening by sharing 7 very short stories. And I'll begin with Shagufta and Shafkat from Pakistan. This is a Christian couple. They were prosecuted for blasphemy and they were sentenced to death in 2013 for allegedly sending blasphemous text messages. Now, both of them were illiterate, but they were still charged and convicted. They spent 8 years on death row. We were able to help successfully get them off death row, out of Pakistan. They're now living safely here in Europe with their family. But they spent 8 years on death row for something they allegedly texted. This is Abdul Baki Saeed Abdo. He is living in Egypt right now, living in prison. He's been there for over 2 years. Originally from Yemen, he converted to Christianity, and then he joined and facilitated a Facebook group that he discussed and shared with others, those interested in also converting to Christianity. He is still awaiting trial. This is Rhoda Jatau. Some of you may recall it did reach a lot of mainstream media. In 2022, so a couple of years ago, a young girl, Deborah Emmanuel Yakubu, she was killed in Nigeria because she had celebrated in a class WhatsApp group thanking Jesus for helping her with her exams. Her classmates rallied around and killed her for blasphemy, and they filmed it. Rhoda shared a video of that with others, and for sharing that video of Deborah's death, she has been prosecuted for blasphemy as well, and she is awaiting trial. She spent 2 years in prison. So we see in Asia, in Africa and other places, criminal prosecutions for alleged blasphemy, for things sent via text, via WhatsApp, or posts on Facebook. But this is not something that is just happening in faraway lands. I think we're all familiar with Päivi Räsänen from Finland. She's one of the longest standing members of the Finnish parliament. She has spent 5 years being investigated by the police and prosecuted, 2 trials, a 3rd trial coming up at the Finnish Supreme Court, for posting a picture of some Bible verses on Twitter in 2019, directed towards the leadership of her church. There's been 4 criminal charges, 3 court cases, 2 defendants. It's still ongoing for someone sharing their beliefs online. Rodrigo Ivan Cortez, a former congressman, now a civil society leader in Mexico. Now, in Mexico, the sections of the Mexico Congress are reserved, seats in that Congress are reserved for women. A number of biological males who identified as women started taking those seats, taking those parliamentary positions. And Rodrigo spoke out about this in a series of social media posts. He was charged and he was convicted for gender-based political violence. What does that even mean? It had nothing to do with violence, but he was fined. He was ordered to publish an apology. He had to publish that apology every day for 30 days that was drafted by the court. He was ordered to take a course on gender-based political violence, and he was entered into a national register of persons sanctioned in political matters against women. So all of these people, 5 people, different continents, they've all faced penalties in the last couple of years for something that they have allegedly posted on a digital platform. But the censorship doesn't end there. Increasingly, governments around the world are taking actions against the platforms themselves. So Billboard Chris is an example. He's a Canadian father of two. He is very well known for making these sandwich boards, these billboards, and going around different streets around the world and filming his interactions with members of the public. He had posted a news article on Twitter that raised questions about an appointment of the WHO who was meant to be giving transgender guidance to young people. And you can look up the story, but let's just say the person they were appointing might not be the best suited for this role. A point that he made on Twitter, the Australian government, through one of their new agencies just set up, called the E-Safety Commission, ordered it to be, first of all, taken down, and then geo-blocked, and then Twitter refused, and then Billboard Chris refused, and that's ongoing litigation right now in Australia. So we see censorship against individuals, we see governments then taking actions against the platforms, and then if they refuse to comply, we see what happened recently in Brazil. During the last 5 years, a sole Supreme Court justice in Brazil, Alexander de Moraes, has essentially organized a campaign behind closed doors censoring social media posts. X refused to comply with this. There was a standoff between X and the judge, which ultimately led to the entire platform being shut down during election season. And in the decision of Alexander de Moraes, he made it extremely clear. He said that there was a real danger of negatively influencing the electorate in 2024 with massive misinformation with the aim of unbalancing the electoral result. So he closed down the biggest free speech platform in a country because he was concerned it might influence an election. And Twitter was only, or X was only allowed online again after that election had finished. So 7 stories, let me draw some common threads. Firstly, it's happening on every continent. I picked examples from all 6 continents. Another common thread is that these are all ADF cases, so I could have given many other examples, but these are just some from our own stable. And increasingly, it's all digital communication. It's digital speech, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter X, or so forth. And that is not surprising because we live in the digital age where so much of our communication now either takes place online or through digital platforms. And so in the next half an hour or so before we have time for discussion and Q&A, I really want to focus on this topic of digital communication and ask 3 questions, hopefully answer some of them as well. Why is this global censorship happening and why now? Where is all of it heading? And what can we do about it? So first of all, why is this global censorship happening and why is it happening right now? Well, to take a step back from that question, the reality is that throughout history, those in power have sought to censor speech in one form or another, and particularly speech that challenges the status quo or challenges those in power. And we stand here in Vienna, where so many over the years gathered together to smuggle illicit material behind the Iron Curtain, whether it was books, Bibles, or even blank pieces of paper. I was researching this recently and I hadn't realized how much blank pieces of paper have been censored throughout history. It's true, you can look it up as well. Most recently in Russia and in China. And I think something about the banning of blank pieces of paper reminds me, at least, that there's no limiting principle to what those in power will choose to censor if they think they can get away with it and if it threatens their position. They will censor as much as they can. Therefore, the limits on this censorship, they really come from the courts and how the courts keep that power in check, and from the people. What the people are prepared to put up with, what the people are prepared to fight for. So as we look across history and we look around the world today, we see there's nothing particularly unique about censorship, but what is unique about this moment in time is the rise of the digital age, ushering in the digital public square and with that, digital forms of censorship. And that's what I really want to focus on this evening. So let's go back in time a few years. Some of us will remember the glory years of the early 90s. It's 1991, the internet launches, and I see the internet launching as it was ushering in this new era of information flow. I imagine it was something like when the printing press hit about 500 years ago. All of a sudden, information could spread widely all around the world, all at the same time. And it was very optimistic in these early days. And we had all of these social media platforms then start to rise up about a decade later. And they were built from the very beginning on the idea of the free flow of information and how that would be better for humanity. So Mark Zuckerberg, for example, he said in 2009, "We believed that people being able to share the information they wanted and having access to the information they wanted, it's just a better world." And then a couple of years later, a Twitter executive said, "We remain neutral as to the content because our general counsel and CEO like to say that we are the free speech wing of the free speech party." So this was the early days of the internet, massive free flow of information, massive explosion of knowledge and discussion. It was all hopeful. The early founders of these platforms were hopeful about what would happen as a result of all this new speech that would be unleashed around the world. But then something happened in the timeline, so a shock to the system. There was this moment, and it's relatively recently, that something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. And in fact, two things happened either side of the Atlantic. There was a moment of crisis. You had the election of Trump, and you had Brexit. And I'm not here to talk politics this evening. What I am here to say that both of these events completely shook both sides of the Atlantic because neither event was supposed to happen. And I went to bed the night before Brexit, and the polls were showing 90+% likelihood of Remain. And that was at about 10 p.m. the night before. And it was similar, if you look at the odds and all the rest of it, with the US election, it was similar. And then something happened. And so the elites, those in power, were shaken by this. These events were not supposed to happen. And so there was a question, were they out of touch with citizens? Were they out of touch with the people? Should they course correct and figure out how to reconnect with people? That is not the conclusion that was drawn. The conclusion that was drawn essentially is that people have been misled, people have been tricked, people have been lied to, and we've got to do something about it. And there was a great article in The Guardian this week, just a couple of days ago, for those of you who know The Guardian in the UK, always good for a take on these things. And the opinion, it said this: 2016 was a tear in the information space, a dawning realization that the world as we know it, stable, fixed by facts, balustraded by evidence, was now a rip in the fabric of reality. In other words, this author is saying the world that I liked, my stable, fact-based world, had been ripped apart, had been torn. And so we see a couple of things happen during this time, one of which was this meteoric rise in the term misinformation and disinformation. It basically had remained relatively flat in the decades before, but 2016 comes and people are searching for an explanation. Why Brexit? Why Trump? Why are we so out of touch? No, they didn't ask that. They said, the people have been tricked. They've been misled. And so this term just exponentially grows. That, in turn, passes down into a lot of decisions that were made, particularly legislative and policy decisions. So we see patterns like this emerging. This is laws passed before 2016 on misinformation. There were 14 of them in that period before 2016. Period afterwards, 91. So there really was a tear in the fabric of reality. And we see everything that's followed in the last almost decade as a reaction, I think, to this moment in time. And then what happened next? COVID. I don't think COVID has caused what we're seeing today in terms of rising global censorship. I think it acted as a huge accelerant to the trend. In that year alone of 2020, 36 countries around the world passed misinformation laws. So looking for an explanation as to why all this is happening, I return to the great source of The Guardian. This same article from this week, and this is really worth paying attention to. Here is what the opinion writer says. You have a subscription, enjoy your clean, hygienic, fact-checked news, then come with me into the information sewers, where we will wade through the excrement everyone else consumes. Trump is cholera. His hate, his lies, it's an infection. It's in the drinking water now. Our information system is London's stinking streets before the Victorian miracle of sanitation. We fix that through engineering. And then she concludes the piece, we're all wading through the information sewers. Trump is a bacillus, but the problem is the pipes. We can and we must fix this. So take a step back. She's writing for The Guardian. She's saying that what she writes is the clean, hygienic, fact-checked news, and everyone else, literally the words she used, everyone else is in the sewers. Everything that you read is in the sewer, but you can trust her because she writes for The Guardian. And she has a plan. She has a plan, engineering, or to continue the analogy, she's got to fix the pipes. So what does that look like? It has been referred to as the Censorship Industrial Complex. That is what fixing the pipes or the engineering means, and this is a diagram of it. Now, there's 50 organizations on it. I'm not going to go through them all. But let me summarize what the diagram is. It's a network of ideologically aligned, governmental, non-profit, media, tech, finance, and academic institutions that are colluding to censor vast swathes of speech that they claim threatens democracy, including speech on a wide array of social and political issues. They're weaponizing terms like hate and misinformation and disinformation to censor speakers directly, to pressure digital platforms to censor, and to threaten to shut down those platforms that refuse to bend the knee to these censorship demands. And what you see on the screen is just a tiny fraction of it. So before we turn to my second question, where is this all heading? I just want to summarize where we're at so far. We've seen that throughout history, those in power have always sought to censor speech with which they disagree. And at the extreme end of that spectrum, Sophia referred to it earlier, we can look at the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century here in Europe, or other authoritarian regimes around the world today. But what makes our moment so unique at this moment in time is the rise of the digital public square, and digital communication being the dominant method of information sharing in the 21st century. So in this context, those in power have sought for the past decade to rein this back, to do the engineering, to fix the pipes so that all of us are taken out of the sewers, so to speak, and into the clean, hygienic waters of The Guardian. So we have a stated goal of protecting democracy from extremism, popularism, and ironically, the strategy to achieve this goal is censorship. They're targeting so-called hate speech and misinformation, disinformation, and we can talk more about why those terms in particular during the discussion time. And this is achieved primarily through three different methods: by censoring the speaker directly, through censoring the speaker through the platform, or through threatening to shut down the platform itself. And the mechanism for all of this is what's being referred to as the Censorship Industrial Complex. So that sets things up, and that was the longest answer to the first three questions. But the second question is, where is all of this heading? Well, we see a relentless, and I mean relentless, bombardment of new censorship laws all around the world, almost all the time. Ursula von der Leyen and the World Economic Forum says that misinformation and disinformation is the #1 threat facing humanity today. The EU is pushing an EU-wide hate speech law It's just introduced the Digital Services Act that will further regulate the digital public square. It's threatening platforms that don't comply, like X. National governments are pushing for more and more censorship, often through the guise of combating hate speech and misinformation. And this truly is relentless. Every day, in every part of the world, a new bill, a new piece of legislation, a new policy, thinking if we could just censor more speech, then the world would be a better place. We also see a relentless bombardment of new non-legislative initiatives designed to censor speech. And again, I couldn't possibly go through them all, but we hear new terms being created like information disorder or infodemics. This is the idea that there's just too much information out there and we require elite gatekeepers to sift through it all for us because we can't do that for ourselves. There are new agreements, new codes of conduct, new compacts that we barely know about being discussed and decided at international institutions and in collusion with big tech at the United Nations, the European Union, and all around the world. And we see what I would call a global censorship playbook being rolled out on pretty much every continent. When you see it, you see that almost everyone in power is using the same language, arguing and attempting the same thing. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples. I've already mentioned Brazil and Alexander de Moraes, the Brazilian Supreme Court judge. So he explained the need to ban, quote, the use of social networks by extremist digital populists with the massive dissemination of hate speech and anti-democratic messages and the use of disinformation to erode the pillars of democracy and the rule of law. So here's a Supreme Court judge in Brazil shutting down an entire social media platform alone. Ursula von der Leyen gave her keynote speech at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, and she said, let me go back to the #1 concern of the Global Risk Report, disinformation and misinformation. Tackling this ban has been our focus since the very beginning of my mandate. With our Digital Services Act, we defined the responsibilities of large internet platforms on the content they promote and propagate. A responsibility to children and vulnerable groups targeted by hate speech, but also a responsibility to our societies as a whole. So you have Brazil, you have Europe, you have the US, Kamala Harris, obviously US presidential candidate, and she explained her plan if she was elected by saying, we will direct law enforcement to counter this extremism. We'll hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms because they have a responsibility to respond to this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we're going to hold you accountable. So 3 extremely powerful people on 3 different continents in the same year, essentially saying the same thing. Now, ADF has offices all around the world, and to ensure that we have messaging discipline, we create messaging sheets, and we use those messaging sheets in lots of different contexts to make sure that as a ministry, as an organization, we're speaking in the same voice, in the same way, in different places. And when I see something like this, I think, they're working off the same messaging sheet. That's what it looks like. It's basically, they're saying the same thing. So we're at a critical moment in history. The space for free speech is shrinking at the exact moment that our reliance on digital communication is exploding. And I think we broadly have 2 choices at this point. Either the digital public square that we rely on far more than we could possibly imagine and will only continue to do so, either that gets controlled and regulated out of existence, or we say enough is enough. But what is clear is this: if we want to save free speech in the digital age, the age that will continue on for the next century, then we don't have much time. And that brings me to my final question: what can we do about it? I want to be provocative for a moment and say the first thing is we in Europe have to wake up. Our freedoms are being eroded, and honestly, I believe that most Europeans are barely paying attention. Partly, I think this is out of a sense of apathy. Partly, I think it's out of a sense of naivety, that such laws won't affect us because we're nice people. I would never commit hate speech. I would never commit misinformation, as if you get to define what those terms mean. The people I mentioned in the start of this talk are all faithful Christians. I mentioned 7 of them, not committing hate speech or misinformation in their opinion, just faithfully sharing their beliefs, facing criminal penalties. But as I tour around this continent, I meet person after person who thinks there's nothing to worry about because I'm a good person and this will never affect me. Secondly, we have to stand up for those who are being censored. That doesn't always mean that we have to agree with exactly what they said or exactly how they said it, but I think it's important that the freedom that we protect for others is the freedom that we want for ourselves. And I think that we have to not allow people to be censored without a fight. There has to be a pushback. There has to be a people who say, we don't accept this, we don't tolerate it, we're not okay with it, we stand with these people. We have to start better standing up for those who are being censored. And I think, again, to be provocative, that also means we have to be prepared to be offended ourselves sometimes. That is the cost of living in a free speech society and a democracy. Thirdly, we have to be vigilant what our own governments are doing, both domestically in our own countries, and what they're pushing behind closed doors at these international institutions. As I mentioned earlier, 91 different laws have been passed since 2016 on misinformation alone. Is your country one of them? And if so, how are they defining misinformation in this legislation, if they're even defining it at all? The one pattern I have seen around the world is this. When those in power seek to censor their citizens, they try and do so very quickly with rushed legislation that gets almost no scrutiny, or they try and do so secretly through policy frameworks and compacts and agreements with big tech and international bodies that none of us have any say in. And they try and do so with vaguely worded laws, always addressing a vague new threat, as if there isn't enough criminal legislation already. So pushing back, I think, means being vigilant to what is happening, shining light on what is happening, and when we do that, I think we have a much better chance of defending freedom of speech. And I give Ireland as an example. So Ireland follows this template. The Irish government already has at its disposal a wide array of laws that can censor the speech of its citizens. But it wanted more, and it tried to pass a far-reaching hate crime bill that included criminal penalties for hate speech that did not define hate speech. The Irish rose up against this, as did we, as did many others from all around the world. We shone light on what was happening. We probed and asked questions. How you want to criminalize hate speech? How do you define it? But you don't define it. Why don't you define it? You don't define it because you want the broadest powers possible to interpret it in the future however you want, is how the minister explained that answer. So when you try and put the brakes on these things and try and slow them down, engage the people, we can see success. And we saw in Ireland just last month, the government announced that it would be dropping these provisions. Fourthly, we have to work relentlessly to unwind and dismantle the censorship industrial complex. Now, taking on cases to help victims and pushing back on new draconian legislation is essential, but it's not enough. In the last decade or more, we've seen an entire web of censorship develop, and it needs to be taken down. And it will take a long time, and I think it probably goes far deeper than we realize. But we have to do it, otherwise there will be another Päivi Räsänen in the future, again and again and again. And fifthly and finally, we have to use our freedom of speech, and this goes to Sophia's point on self-censorship, Because if we self-censor out of fear, then the censors have won. Päivi Räsänen likes to say, with regard to freedom of speech, when it comes to it, we either use it or lose it. And I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to dare to speak boldly, to share our opinions, because while fear of censorship is contagious, I think so is courage. And the more that we are courageous in speaking out, the more I think we can encourage others to do so as well. So let me conclude with a sentence or two. I believe that disrupting and ultimately dismantling this apparatus of censorship that we've seen develop over the last decade or so is one of the great free speech battles of our time. And honestly, if we're to be successful, it's now or never. So with that, thank you very much.